Hello, I'm Michael, and for the final presentation of Eureka, the title is the appropriate credit rating for Indonesia in 2023 is going to be between 69.5 and 38.3. In this paper, I argue that the appropriate credit rating for Indonesia is 2023 is going to be between 69.5 and 38.3. Following are my arguments. First, Indonesia's 2023 rating should be no higher than Malaysia's 2016 rating, which is 69.5. Second, Indonesia's 2023 rating should be no lower than Cyprus' 2016 rating, which is 38.3. My defense is based on the debt to GDP data for these countries, as well as the GDP data for these three countries. Some previous research I've done is about how some historical crises which happened to Indonesia and some current events can affect the economic future for this country. I've also done some research about the GDP and debt to GDP data for the country of Indonesia and what the data can predict that this country's GDP and debt to GDP is going to be like during the upcoming future years. The key aspects of this statement is how to provide trustworthy information is to gather and compare the data of debt to GDP and GDP for the country of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Cyprus. By comparing these countries' debt to GDP as well as the GDP, we can predict that what the rating and the credit will be like during 2023. Predicting this is important because this will let us get to know some of the developing countries during this period of time, and this will also be beneficial to investors who are thinking about investing in these three countries. The problem my study is addressing is about how the current status of credit rating for the country of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Cyprus, the historical crisis which happened to these countries that might affect these countries' status, and the future risk rating for these three countries. In addition, I'll be using the strategy of comparing these three countries' debt to GDP status and the GDP status in order to confirm that the appropriate credit rating for Indonesia in 2023 is going to be between 69.5 and 38.3, given that Malaysia's 2016 rating is 69.5, Cyprus' 2016 rating is 38.3, and Indonesia's 2016 rating is 57. This study is important because of multiple reasons. First of all, for me, this study will let me know better about the situation, historical crisis, what kind of crucial crisis which happened during the past about these three countries and affected the GDP or the debt to GDP data, etc., with the developing countries such as Indonesia and the countries such as Malaysia and Cyprus. The way I developed this study can also be similar to the study which some economics might do to predict what Indonesia's credit rating is going to be in the future, such as 2023 and such. I believe by showing my study, I can also inform other people who are watching this study about the economic situation for Indonesia, Malaysia, and Cyprus, the historical crisis, and the future which is predicted on these three countries based on the data. At first, I did some background research on Indonesia about the economic situation and some historical crises which happened to this country, such as Indonesia's exchange rate system. Indonesia implements a free-floating exchange rate regime, and exchange rate stability is necessary to achieve and maintain price and financial system stability. In pursuit of this mandate, Bank Indonesia adopted the Inflation Targeting Framework (ITF) as its monetary policy framework on 1st July 2005. As we can see below in this image, Indonesia's economic has increased continuously. But even though Indonesia's economy has grown during the 1980s and 1990s, there was a financial crisis which happened inside the country during 1997, which can be one of the main factors for its sudden decay in multiple aspects, such as GDP and etc. As a result, this crisis led to multiple political reforms. The depression Indonesia faced during the 1930s can be one of the other factors which made the sudden drop of data. According to one paper about the crisis in Indonesia written by Dr. Stephen Sherlock in parliamentofaustralia.com, he stated that the Indonesian rupiah was initially not affected by the pressure on other regional currencies in the early 1997 because it did not appear to suffer such acute problems of a large current account deficit and high dollar denominated foreign debt. For several years in the Indonesian Central Bank, which is the Bank of Indonesia, has also allowed the rupiah to float within the range of 8%, allowing 4 to 5% annual depreciation from 1995. When Thai, Malaysian, and Filipino currencies began to weaken in early July 1997, Bank of Indonesia took the preemptive measure of increasing the band within which rupiah could flow from 8% to 12%. By the beginning of August, however, the rupiah appeared to have caught the contagion and was falling below the 12% band. Bank of Indonesia was forced to allow the currency to flow freely, and by the end of October, it had fallen from the June 1997 rate of around 2,400 to the dollar to a new low of 3,600 to the dollar. In addition, there are also some current events which I have researched, such as the Fitch Ratings has confirmed Indonesia's sovereign credit rating at BBB, which is investment grade, with a stable outlook, as announced today, which was June 28, 2022. According to Fitch, key factors that support the affirmation are a favorable medium-term growth outlook and a low government debt to GDP ratio. Fitch underscored several challenges, including higher external debt ratios, low government revenue, as well as weak structural features, such as governance indicators and GDP per capita compared to those from BBB category peers. I've also researched about Indonesia's debt to GDP ratio, as we can see below in this image. As we can see in the information above, the debt to GDP ratio for Indonesia have increased in some scale, which lead to another topic I've researched about, which is the financial mismanagement. It is not so much Indonesia's total debt that worries investors as its relatively high foreign debt exposure, which makes the economy vulnerable to the global crisis. Official figures show that 40% of public debt was foreign-owned last year. In addition to current account deficit of 3% of GDP, Indonesia's external debt has made it one of the most exposed countries in Asia to the emerging market sell-off this year. The rupiah has fallen nearly 9% against the dollar this year. After doing the background research, I moved on with the question of what would Indonesia's credit rating in 2023 would be, since one of the major websites I researched on was institutionalinvestor.com. It showed that Indonesia is in the 27th space with a credit rating of 57. Then I decided to choose two countries to compare Indonesia with. One of them is higher than Indonesia, which is Malaysia, in the 37th place with 69.5 of credit rating. And the other one is lower than Indonesia, which is Cyprus, in the 87th place with a credit rating of 38.3. And by successfully solving this question, it will be beneficial for the economics because this will be predicting the credit rating for Indonesia in 2023, which is in the upcoming future. To sum up, this method is to compare three countries' debt to GDP and GDP in order to prove that the appropriate credit rating for Indonesia in 2023 is going to be between 69.5 and 38.3. Now that I've finished my research, I started to gather the data for Malaysia and Cyprus on the debt to GDP as well as GDP, as we can see in the information below. As we can see on these graphs above, even though the government debt is in a decreasing form, it is still very high compared to Indonesia as well as Malaysia. On the other hand, for GDP, even though Cyprus' GDP growth is higher than Malaysia's, the total GDP for Malaysia is way much higher than Cyprus' total GDP. As we can see in this graph below, this is a comparison between three countries on the debt to GDP ratio. Indonesia's debt to GDP ratio is the lowest, while Malaysia is in the middle and Cyprus in the highest. As we all know, the higher the debt to GDP for a country is, the less credit rating they will get. Thus, I predict that Indonesia's credit rating will increase vastly, but it will certainly not surpass the credit rating for Malaysia, because even though they are in a bad position for debt to GDP ratio, for Malaysia, their credit rating is high enough for them to stay above Indonesia. In addition, I believe Cyprus will stay similarly throughout the process since they have the highest debt to GDP ratio. These two graphs above can even more prove this thesis. As we can see on the left graph, Indonesia's GDP is thriving compared to the other G2 countries, which means that the credit rating for Indonesia will increase vastly, although Malaysia's status is way too high for Indonesia. Thus, I believe Indonesia's credit rating in 2023 will still be below Malaysia's for a small amount, and Cyprus will still be the same throughout this process. As we can see on the second graph, above the GDP growth annually, Cyprus surprisingly is at the top, with Indonesia in the middle and Malaysia at the bottom. This graph can support that Cyprus will increase its credit rating, but because of the graphs earlier, this would be a weak proof of it. Thus, it would not be strong support. As Indonesia's GDP growth is slightly higher than Malaysia, this would not affect the relationship between Indonesia and Malaysia that deep, with Indonesia's credit rating increasing while Malaysia's credit rating increasing more slowly. To sum up, I argue that the appropriate credit rating for Indonesia in 2023 is going to be between 69.5 and 38.3 based on the information provided above. GDP-wise, Indonesia's GDP is higher than both Malaysia and Cyprus, which provide them a chance to increase their credit rating. GDP growth-wise, even though Cyprus is the highest, Indonesia and Malaysia does not need to worry about it because their GDP is way much higher than Cyprus's. It's in a total different scale. Debt to GDP-wise, Indonesia is the lowest, which again provides them to increase their debt rating, credit rating. Even though Indonesia has a lot of advantages during these comparisons, they will not surpass Malaysia since there is such a big difference during 2016. But I believe that Indonesia will still be increasing, but below Malaysia and definitely above Cyprus.